Titus 2:11 and 12 says this, for the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men. So all of those, that says all men. All of those out there that says, well, I don't even believe in God. Well, God's grace has reached you. You just didn't believe. It says it's teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. See, grace teaches us how to live. We never learn how to live pleasing to God on our own, folks. But see, teaches. That grace of God, that all that God is, that He's extended to us, teaches us. See, when our children were born, just say that we wanted, you know, when he was born, we decided he'd be a marathon runner. We're going to start training him to be a marathon runner. That's teaching him. But just because he can't walk yet, we don't throw him out. Do we? We teach him to crawl. We teach him to walk. We teach him to run. Grace will do the same thing, folks. Just because you might be stumbling, if you're still listening, grace will teach you to walk straight. Grace will pick you up when you fall and get your knees bruised and brush you off and teach you to walk stronger. See, it's teaching us, but it's always teaching us to live soberly, righteously, and godly. It's teaching us how to reach that point to where we can, without even thinking, do the right thing. It's a teaching. It's a teaching. God's unmerited favor and love. And in that grace, folks, is everything you need. Everything I need. See, we can refuse to learn the lessons, but grace is there for us if we want to learn the lesson. It enables us, folks, to be pleasing to God. It enables us to walk in the joy and the peace of God. See, religion can teach you how to walk in like a living zombie. That's what religion does. It'll set you forth rules and say, if you've got your hair cut just right, and if you dress just right, and if you do this just right. And so we're always trying to do everything just right, that by some laws and principles that man sets out. And so we're just walking in that zombie state. But grace, folks, will give you that desire and that ability. And when you fall, you don't feel like the whole world's crashed in. You just say, God, I missed that one. And you know that He's picking you up. He'll give you the freedom. There's nothing like being free, folks. And he that the Son sets free is free indeed. There's nothing like being free. Living in Jesus free. Not worrying that any minute, He's going to get so mad, He's just going to cast me out. Knowing that He knew you. Knowing that He knew before you got there what you was going to do. But He was going to be right there to pick you up if you wanted up. That's grace. That's the love of God, folks. That's the difference between walking in religion and the freedom of Jesus. It teaches us. There's an old church hymnal that says there's grace for every need. Grace for you. Grace for me. Grace that's full. Grace that's free. You know, if grace wasn't free, if it wasn't free, we couldn't afford it anyway. What price tag would we put on the unmerited favor of God? How much would it be worth? More than any of us could afford. More than we could afford. In 2 Corinthians 12, the Apostle Paul wrote about a thorn in his flesh. And, we had great theological debates on what that thorn was. The Bible's pretty clear if you look at it, but we're not going to get into a debate about what the thorn was. But Paul began to pray, and he said, I besought the Lord thrice that it should depart from me. And the Lord answered him and said, my grace is sufficient. A lot of people say, well, God said, just keep it, Paul. I'll just be with you, you just keep it. That ain't what he was saying. He said, Paul, I've already extended to you enough power to overcome that thing. And I proved to you Paul did. My grace is sufficient. And I'm going to tell you this morning, folks, I don't care what you're facing in life, God's grace is sufficient to carry you through victorious. It's enough. No, it's more than enough. If we believe Him. If we walk in Him. Well, I asked him and it's still there. Paul asked him 3 times. And it didn't say how long it was before Paul got into that grace, but Paul got into that grace. And Paul said, my strength is made perfect in weakness. His strength is made perfect in my weakness. What Paul was saying, when I finally got to that place where I knew I couldn't handle it, then I began to expect God to do what He said He'd do. I began to expect a miracle. As long as we think we can fix something, we're prone to just leave God out of it, aren't we? But when we get to where we can't fix it, then we start, if we're walking in that grace, then we start expecting God to show up. And then faith begins to work what God said. See, God's promises are real. But our faith makes that appointment for them to be real in our life. Before I was saved, before you were saved, that whosoever will was to you. But when we begin to allow that faith that God has, that gift to operate in our life, then we came to God and salvation became ours, just like He said. See? Just like He said. And this morning, folks, whatever you're facing, there is sufficiency in God's grace for that. He's extended all His goodness toward us, folks. He wants us to be supplied. He wants us to have peace. He wants us to have joy. He wants us to live in all the goodness that He is. He's extended to us. And people would preach just what I read there in Ephesians. By grace, you're saved through faith, and that not of yourself. They say, oh yeah, God's extended His grace. And there turn right around and tell you that God wants you sick because He's trying to teach you something. They'll turn right around and tell you that God doesn't want you to prosper because as long as you're poor, you'll depend on Him. No, in His grace, folks, is enough. If He's extended His grace to you to save you, He wants you to walk in the fullness of what He's given you. That's like me walking up to you and say, here's $100, but don't spend it. You might as well have a page out of the Sears catalog. Now, when God extended His grace, He wanted you to spend it. Walk in it. He wanted you to walk in it. He wanted me to walk in it. He didn't give it. He didn't send it our way to leave us where we were, but to move us to where He knew that we could be. See, you talk to people about coming to Christ, and they say the devil does all this junk, this smoke and mirrors, and he's got people's minds and stuff. But you talk to them about coming to Christ, and they'll say, I really want to, but I can't live it. True. You can. He can. Isn't it? But it's like saying, if God's called me to do something, And I say, I can't do it. That's saying God didn't really know what he was talking about. If God's called you, he's already, just like David, he's already looked ahead of you and knew you could accomplish what he called you to do. Is that all right? If God knew your thoughts afar off and still saved you, folks, he knew you could accomplish what he was sending you to do. See, when I got saved and God began to move on me to teach, I never wanted to be in front of anybody. I was like Moses. I can't talk. I don't want to be in front of anybody. Till I found out what he was talking about, what I could do. He was talking about what he could do. See? I tell folks, I've got to face the radio. I didn't want to be in front of anybody. But God has touched people through the gift that he's given me. I have taught one that taught one. See? And whatever God has placed on your heart, whatever God has told you, he will see to it that you're able to accomplish. Don't worry about what you can do. You couldn't save yourself. He did. You can't heal yourself. He did. You can't even make yourself prosper except in the worldly sense, which will kill you in the end. But he can make you prosper and add no sorrow to it. He can. His grace, folks, this morning, his grace is more than enough for all our needs. We don't have to get good any better than what you are right now for God's grace to touch you, to reach you. You know, God's grace has reached down in prisons and saved people in prisons, mass murder. God's grace has reached into lands where they taught that the Christian God was an idol and touched people. He saved Islamics. He saved Buddhists. Do you think that they were good enough? No. They weren't good enough, just like we weren't good enough. But when God looks and he sees a heart that can be used, then the grace is extended to all men. To all men. I want you to know this morning, if you got nothing else out of this, that you're more than enough to accomplish in God's will, in God's grace, in God's strength. You have more than enough right now to accomplish what God has sent you to accomplish.